What's up everyone? Welcome to this video on the Archon Type B trigger system. I will be explaining the theory and operation behind this unique take on a striker fired action. What I have laid out before you is every single component in this pistol that interacts with the trigger system in any way. I've seen a few good videos that give an overview of how this system functions, but none of them took it to a level of detail I was hoping for. Since I've owned this pistol and taken it apart, I've answered all the outstanding questions I had about this trigger system. Hopefully I can explain it well enough and in enough detail to pass the understanding I think I now have on to you. Let's get into it. We are going to look at the general operation of this trigger system before tearing this apart and getting into the individual components. This is the striker, and the striker spring is over here, offset to the side. There's a little tube in here that the compressed striker spring is pushing forwards towards the breech face. That tube has a little hook on it. You can see it right here. That little hook is pulling the striker forward with it. My guess is that they designed the striker and striker spring to be separate, so they could both be smaller diameter. Offsetting them in this manner allowed the slide to be shorter. A striker assembly with a larger diameter spring around it may have made the slide taller. This little projection right here is caught by this face of the sear as the slide comes back forward, cocking it and making it ready to fire. There is a striker safety block, or a lever, I guess, in this case. It pivots to the side as the trigger is pulled and allows the striker to go all the way forward and hit the primer. This trigger does have an inertial safety, but instead of a little dingus in the middle of the trigger like a Glock, it has a separate trigger shoe that pivots. Once we disengage this trigger safety, that's when we get into the take-up of our trigger pull. Here's the trigger bar. The take-up moves the trigger bar into contact with this fin on the side of the sear. Also, during the take-up, this angled face on this little fin of the trigger bar that's sticking up right here is starting to push the striker block lever to the side. After the take-up, once the trigger bar is in contact with the sear, the trigger bar pushes the sear to the side. It's also fully disengaging the striker block lever at this time. The sear pivots out of the way and releases the striker that was caught right here, and it goes forward through this channel and ignites the round. As the slide starts coming rearward, this piece with the little ramp right here, I'm going to call this the disconnector rail, pushes the trigger bar down by contacting the top of this little fin, disconnecting the trigger bar from the sear. When you let your finger off the trigger, it comes forward and pops back up. Take up, wall, brake, disconnector rail pushes this guy down. It pops down beneath the little fin on that sear and allows it to pivot back into place, so when the slide comes forward, it once again catches and fully cocks the striker. When you let off the trigger and let it forward, that trigger bar is going to come forward of that little fin and pop back up into place. There's your reset. There's my take up to where the trigger bar hits that little shark fin on the sear, and then there's where it pushes it out of the way. This trigger bar spring is pushing it up into engagement. The slide starts reciprocating. We're holding the trigger back. That little disconnector rail comes and it pushes that down, and it pushes it below the little fin on that sear. Let's compare this fully precocked system to a partially precocked striker system in a Glock. In a partially precocked system, the trigger bar interacts directly with the striker. If the trigger bar actuates a separate sear, then that means it's a fully precocked striker system. On the Glock, we see the striker here. Its spring is on the outside of the striker itself, not offset with a separate carrier like in the Archon. Here's the striker safety block. The trigger bar also has a little fin on it that actuates this block and disengages it as you pull the trigger. The fin pushes the safety block up into the slide. On an Archon, that fin pivots a little lever. The back of this trigger bar right here is what directly interacts with the striker, not a separate sear. It's called partially precocked because as you pull the trigger, it pulls the striker the rest of the way back against spring force before dropping down and releasing it. On the Archon, the striker is fully cocked and it's held right here waiting to be released. Let's now compare the Archon's fully precocked striker system to what I would consider a more conventional design in this M&P 2.0. Here you see we have a trigger bar, and this trigger bar contacts a sear actuator which pivots the sear down, releasing the fully precocked striker. The Archon has a sear that pivots as well, but it pivots this way instead of up and down like this one. There's a spring under the back of this sear right here, and it's oriented vertically. In the Archon, since the sear pivots this way, there is a sear spring oriented transversely across the fire control unit. I'll show this in more detail later. The M&P has a striker block in the slide, very similar to the Glock, and it's disengaged in the same way. This fin on the trigger pushes that block up into the slide as the trigger is pulled rearward. The last comparison I want to make is to the CZ P10 series. This is a partially precocked striker system, similar to the Glock, but what I want to focus on here is the striker safety block. I would say it's more similar to the Archon. This little wedge on the trigger bar right here pushes this lever to the side to disengage the striker safety block. This little safety lever is integral to the striker assembly in the P10, not contained in the slide like the Archon. Let's look at the individual slide components. This is the firing pin rebound spring. This end goes on a shoulder on the firing pin. This end of the spring goes up against the back of the breech face. This is your striker spring right here. This plunger is captured in the back of the slide by the rear cover plate. This tube right here that houses the spring sits in the slide and it interacts with the striker like that. So you can see that spring force when the striker spring is compressed is going to want to push that striker forward towards the breech. When this striker is pulled back, it pulls this whole tube back with it and compresses the striker spring. The sear pivots out of the way and the spring shoves the tube and the striker forward, igniting the round. This disconnector rail is the pivot point for the firing pin safety block lever, just like that. The firing pin safety block lever spring sits like that, and when this is installed in the pistol, this spring tang right here is pushed up against the inside of the slide, putting tension on it, rotating this guy into engagement with the striker. There's a notch in the shaft of the disconnector rail, so when it's installed, the plunger for the extractor goes through that little notch. The disconnector rail and the striker block lever beneath it can't come out of the slide. Let's look at the trigger components that are in the fire control unit, starting from the back, working to the front. This is the sear spring and plunger. This goes in a transverse hole in the fire control unit here, and you can see this little tab hanging off the sear goes down in this pocket with the sear spring and plunger behind it, forcing it this way. There's this little cross pin. It goes in from the left side, just like that. What that cross pin does is engages with this little groove on the back of the sear, and you can see it has an angular relief on it, so it can pivot this way and this way from a center point on this pin and not bind. The trigger bar sits in here like this on this end. It is attached to the trigger shoe and the bar in the center of the trigger on this roll pin. The trigger bar spring has a little leg that goes down in a pocket there. The coil of it sits in this little cutout, and then this piece of it goes up into a very narrow groove in the trigger bar, and it's captured in there and allows the trigger bar to slide back and forward while putting upward force on it. The trigger bar would go right here. It would be captured by this roll pin, and the trigger bar pivots separately on this pin from this little lever or actuation bar. You can just see this little tiny spring right here. The short tang of it goes in a groove on the back of the trigger shoe. When the trigger shoe pivots back, that is the disengagement of the inertial trigger safety, and all you're feeling is the resistance from this little spring only. This is what I'm going to call the trigger return spring and plunger. It lives in the frame right here and compresses this way. This is the trigger pivot pin, and it doesn't go through the trigger shoe. It goes through this little hole in like the trigger actuation lever. You can see that when the trigger shoe inertial safety gets disengaged, these hooks up here at the top stop on that pivot pin, and that gives a hard stop for this pin right here to pivot around that, and that's what our trigger bar is attached to. This pin goes in behind that trigger actuation lever. This is the end of the trigger shoe safety spring. It is on the back side of the lower trigger pivot pin, and it also needs to go on the back side of this upper cross pin. Let's see what happens when we disengage the trigger shoe safety by pivoting it rearwards. You see, if I try to push it back, this part of the trigger shoe hits the fire control unit right there. Those two little claws in there pivot forward and come up against that lower trigger pivot pin. As soon as it does that, these guys are above this ledge in the fire control unit. Now it starts pivoting that whole trigger shoe and trigger actuation bar backwards. And this, of course, would be pushing the trigger bar backwards along the side of the fire control unit. When I pivot just this shoe, the trigger actuation bar is right here and it's not moving. When I start to pull past there, that's when we start compressing our trigger return spring. I hope this video has provided you with a decent understanding of how this unique, fully pre-cocked striker fire trigger system works. Maybe you saw some aspects of the operation and associated components that were new to you. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.